He never spoke during the 6-hour flight. Just an old man in a wrinkled jacket, sleeping peacefully in 14C. But when the young pilot walked down the aisle during his break and glanced at the passenger's wrist, he froze mid-step. That wasn't just any watch. It was the kind they stopped making after 1973, given only to men who completed missions that were never supposed to exist. What happened next would change everything the pilot thought he knew about the passengers he flew every day. This is the kind of story they don't teach in history books. Before we dive into this tale of hidden heroes and forgotten legends, tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching today? And if you believe these untold stories deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These are the stories that matter, the ones that remind us that heroes walk among us every single day, invisible until someone finally sees them. Flight 447 from Denver to Boston was running smooth at 35,000 feet. Captain Mike Reynolds had been flying commercial routes for 8 years, long enough to recognize the rhythm of red-eye flights. Passengers settled in with books, tablets, or pillows. Flight attendants dimmed the cabin lights. The hum of engines created that familiar white noise that made time feel suspended. Reynolds was third-generation Air Force. His grandfather had flown B-52s in Vietnam. His father had been a fighter pilot in the Gulf War. Mike had chosen commercial aviation instead of military service, a decision that sometimes left him wondering if he'd taken the safer path. The easier road tonight felt like every other red-eye. Routine, predictable, safe. The old man in 14C had been the last aboard. Reynolds noticed him only because of the way he moved, slowly but with purpose, like someone conserving energy for something more important than hurry. He wore a brown leather jacket that looked military surplus, the kind sold in stores but clearly worn by someone who understood its original purpose. His hair was silver white, cut short and neat. His face was weathered, not just by age but by something deeper, the kind of lines that come from squinting into distant horizons, from making decisions when failure meant people didn't come home. The gate agent had flagged his ticket during boarding. Cash payment, she noted quietly to Reynolds. Booked yesterday. No frequent flyer number, no special requests. In the post-9/11 world, cash transactions drew attention. But the man's ID checked out. James Morrison, age 73, address in a small town outside Denver that Reynolds had never heard of. Nothing suspicious, just another elderly passenger who preferred bills to credit cards. The man had nodded politely to the flight attendant when she offered assistance with his bag, a small canvas duffel that looked older than most of the passengers. He tucked it carefully under the seat in front of him, settled into 14C, and closed his eyes before takeoff. No magazine, no book, no phone. Just silence. 2 hours into the flight, Reynolds followed his standard procedure. Leave the cockpit, walk the cabin, check on passengers, stretch his legs. Co-pilot Sarah Chen took the controls. Standard rotation, nothing unusual. The cabin was peaceful. Most passengers slept. A few read under overhead lights. The flight attendants sat quietly in their jump seats, occasionally glancing up from their phones to scan for call buttons. Reynolds moved slowly down the aisle, careful not to disturb anyone. Years of flying had taught him to read passengers at a glance. The businessman in 8A was dreaming about a presentation. The college student in 12B was stressed about exams. The mother in 6C was exhausted from chasing toddlers all day. All normal, all predictable. As he passed row 14, he glanced down at the old man. Morrison's head rested against the window, arms folded across his chest. His breathing was steady, peaceful. The leather jacket had shifted during sleep, and the left sleeve had ridden up slightly. That's when Reynolds saw the watch. At first glance, it looked vintage. Military style, probably from the 1970s. The kind of timepiece collectors paid thousands for at auctions. But as Reynolds looked closer, he noticed details that made his throat tighten. The band wasn't standard issue. It was custom, heavy, built for someone who couldn't afford to have equipment fail. The face was black with white numbers, designed for readability in low light. And there, barely visible on the metal band, was an inscription etched in small, precise letters. Reynolds leaned slightly closer, careful not to wake the sleeping man. The words made his blood run cold. Up Ivory Coast, 1970. Silence is golden. Reynolds felt the world shift beneath his feet. He gripped the seat back to steady himself, his mind racing back to conversations he'd had with his grandfather 20 years earlier. Robert Reynolds had been a Navy pilot during Vietnam. He'd flown missions that weren't supposed to exist, supported operations that had no paper trail, waited on carriers that officially weren't in those waters. On Mike's 18th birthday, after a few beers on the back porch, the old man had told him a story he'd never shared with anyone else. "Son," his grandfather had said, voice low and serious, "there are missions that succeed, missions that fail, and missions that never happened. The worst ones are the ones that never happened, because the men who don't come back from those, they were never there to begin with." Operation Ivory Coast, his grandfather had explained, was a rescue mission planned for November 1970. Not the famous Sun Tay raid that history remembers, but something else entirely. Something smaller, more targeted, more desperate. They called for volunteers. The old man had continued. Had to be unmarried, no kids, no one who'd been missed if they didn't come home. 56 men volunteered. They picked 12. Special Forces, SEALs, Air Force Pararescue, Marines. The best of the best. The mission was simple in concept, impossible in execution. 3 American POWs were being held in a facility so remote, so heavily guarded, that conventional rescue was suicide. But intelligence suggested the prisoners had information that could save hundreds of other American lives. They trained for 6 months, Reynolds' grandfather had said. 6 months of planning, preparation, practice runs. I was supposed to fly extraction, had a bird ready on a carrier that didn't exist, waiting for a signal from men who weren't there. The mission launched on November 18, 1970. 12 men parachuted into enemy territory with orders to retrieve 3 prisoners and extract to a pickup point 20 miles away. The window for extraction was 18 hours. I waited, his grandfather had whispered. Waited on that deck for 36 hours. No signal, no contact, nothing. 3 men eventually made it to the extraction point. Not 12, not 15, including the rescued prisoners. 3. They'd found the facility. They'd found the prisoners. But the intelligence was wrong. The guards were ready. The mission was compromised from the start. The 3 who made it out, his grandfather had said, they carried the bodies of their teammates as far as they could. Then they carried their dog tags. Then they carried their memories. The mission was classified at the highest levels. The families of the 9 men who didn't return were told their sons had died in training accidents, helicopter crashes, equipment failures, clean deaths with closed coffins and military honors. The 3 survivors, his grandfather had said, they got watches, not medals, not recognition, watches, with an inscription that reminded them that silence was the highest form of service. Reynolds had asked what happened to the 3 survivors. His grandfather had shrugged. They disappeared. New identities, new lives, new names. The government made sure they could start over, but they could never talk about what they'd done. Never tell anyone where they'd been. Never seek help for what they'd seen. Standing in the aisle of Flight 447, Reynolds stared at the watch on the sleeping man's wrist and felt history reach across 50 years to tap him on the shoulder. This wasn't a collector's item. This wasn't vintage military surplus. This was one of 3 watches given to 3 men who had volunteered for a mission that officially never happened, who had survived something that couldn't be acknowledged, who had carried secrets that were too dangerous for history books. Reynolds looked at the man's face again. The scar along his jawline that disappeared into his collar. The way his hands rested even in sleep, Not relaxed, but ready. The posture of someone who had trained his body to wake up fighting if necessary. James Morrison wasn't just any elderly passenger. He was a ghost, a living, breathing piece of classified history. Reynolds felt a mixture of awe and responsibility that made his hands shake. His grandfather had waited on a carrier deck for this man and two others, had watched the horizon for 36 hours, hoping to see them coming home. The old pilot had died 3 years ago, taking his secrets with him. But he, at 35,000 feet over Kansas, his grandson was looking at one of the men he'd waited for. One of the three who had made it out. Reynolds thought about the weight of carrying such a secret for 50 years. No parades, no recognition, no ability to seek help for nightmares that featured 9 teammates who didn't make it home. Just silence, and the constant knowledge that speaking the truth would dishonor not just the mission, but the men who had died for it. The watch was more than a timepiece. It was a burden, a reminder, a promise to carry the truth quietly until death made it someone else's responsibility. Reynolds didn't wake the man. He didn't ask questions. He didn't take photos or call anyone or break the silence that had protected this secret for half a century. Instead, he simply stood there for a moment, processing the weight of accidentally discovering a ghost, understanding that some encounters are meant to remain unspoken. When he returned to the cockpit, Chen noticed his expression immediately. "Everything okay, Captain?" she asked. Glancing up from a flight charts, Reynolds settled into his seat, his hands still slightly unsteady. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Just honored to be flying tonight." Chen raised an eyebrow but didn't press. She'd flown with Reynolds long enough to know when he needed space to process something. For the remainder of the flight, Reynolds found excuses to walk past row 14. Not to stay, not to disturb, just to acknowledge. Each time he passed, he gave a subtle nod that the sleeping man never saw, but somehow felt necessary. That he thought about his grandfather, waiting on that carrier deck in 1970. About the 3 men who had eventually made it to the extraction point, carrying the weight of 9 teammates who hadn't. About the families who were told lies that were kinder than the truth. Duddy thought about the decision to give the survivors watches instead of medals, silence instead of recognition. About 50 years of carrying secrets that were too important for applause, too dangerous for therapy, too classified for history. Today, as Flight 447 began its descent into Boston, Morrison woke naturally. He stretched slightly, adjusted his jacket sleeve to cover the watch, and looked out the window at the approaching city lights. Reynolds watched from the cockpit as the man sat quietly during landing, waiting until most passengers had filed out before standing. He moved with the same purposeful slowness, retrieved his canvas bag, and walked toward the exit. Today, as he passed the cockpit where Reynolds was completing post-flight checks, Morrison paused. For just a moment, their eyes met through the open door. Reynolds saw something in the old man's face. Not surprise, but recognition. Somehow, Morrison knew that someone had seen the watch, had understood what it meant, had chosen silence over curiosity. The moment lasted only seconds, but in that brief exchange, Reynolds felt a connection to something larger than himself. A chain of service that connected his grandfather to this man, to himself, bound together by respect for secrets that were bigger than any individual story. Morrison gave the slightest nod. Nothing more. No words. No explanations. No request for silence or promises of secrecy. But in that nod was acknowledgement. One serviceman recognizing another. One keeper of secrets understanding that some truths are too important to speak aloud. Reynolds nodded back, a gesture of respect that needed no translation. Then Morrison disappeared into the Boston terminal, becoming just another passenger among thousands, carrying his burden back into the anonymous crowd where heroes learn to hide. Reynolds never learned Morrison's real name, never discovered which of the 3 survivors he'd encountered, never reported what he'd seen or broke the silence that had protected the secret for 50 years. But every flight after that carried new weight. Every passenger was a potential story, a possible hero, a living piece of history that chose invisibility over recognition. Duddy began to notice details he'd missed before. The way certain older passengers moved, the scars they tried to hide, the watches they wore, and the careful way they avoided eye contact with anyone in uniform. The world was full of ghosts, he realized. Men and women who had done extraordinary things in service of their country, then disappeared into ordinary lives, carrying secrets too important for recognition, too dangerous for acknowledgement. Some served with parades and medals and speeches. Others served with silence and anonymity and the knowledge that the most important missions were often the ones history agreed to forget. Morrison didn't need recognition. He didn't want thanks. He just needed someone to see, to understand, and to remember that some sacrifices are too important for applause. The watch on his wrist wasn't a trophy. It was a responsibility, a reminder that 50 years after volunteering for a mission that never happened, he was still serving, still keeping the secret, still honoring the 9 men who didn't make it home. Heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear brown leather jackets and sit quietly in seat 14C, carrying the weight of history in their silence. Have you ever encountered someone ordinary who turned out to be extraordinary? Someone whose past was written in scars, in silence, in the small details others miss. Someone who served in ways that can never be acknowledged. Share their story in the comments below. Tell us what city you're watching from. But remember, some stories are meant to be honored, not exposed. Some heroes are meant to remain invisible. Because here at the Human Stories, we believe that the most powerful stories don't shout, they whisper. The most important heroes don't seek recognition, they seek to be forgotten. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe and help us keep these quiet legends alive. We'll see you in the next one. And remember, the next time you're on a flight, look around. Pay attention. You might be sitting next to history itself, disguised as just another passenger with nothing to prove and everything to carry.